The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the hills of eastern Kentucky, where Highway 27 stretched like a lonely ribbon between forgotten towns. Millfield was one of those places that used to matter, a community of 3,000 souls that had thrived when Hartwell Manufacturing kept 500 people employed, making furniture for half the southeast. Now, with the factory closed for 8 months, the town felt like a patient on life support, breathing but barely alive. Danny Thompson stood at the edge of the highway, his small hands gripping a piece of cardboard torn from a moving box. The black marker words he'd written in his careful 12-year-old script read, "Please help. Dad hurt. Family needs food." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt as pickup trucks and the occasional sedan passed by, most drivers averting their eyes from the boy who'd become a fixture there for 3 days running. 3 months earlier, Michael Thompson had been working construction on a new bridge outside town when the scaffolding collapsed. The fall had shattered his left leg in 4 places and damaged his spine. 2 surgeries later, he could barely walk to the mailbox, let alone swing a hammer or operate heavy machinery. The workers' compensation checks had stopped coming 6 weeks ago, tied up in paperwork and legal disputes that the family couldn't afford to fight. Sarah Thompson watched her son from the kitchen window of their small house, her heart breaking with each passing car that didn't stop. She'd tried everything, applied for every assistance program, reached out to every church in 3 counties, even swallowed her pride and called her estranged sister in Louisville. Nothing had come through fast enough. The eviction notice was pinned to their front door, giving them 5 more days before the sheriff would come. "Mama, someone's slowing down?" Danny's voice carried across the yard as he waved toward an approaching vehicle. The black SUV with Tennessee plates came to a stop on the highway shoulder, hazard lights blinking. Danny felt his stomach tighten with nervous hope as the driver's side door opened. A woman stepped out, not tall, but with presence that seemed to fill the space around her. Her blonde hair caught the sunlight, and she wore a simple denim jacket over a flowing skirt. When she smiled, Danny felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that things might actually get better. "Well, honey, what's this all about?" Her voice carried a warmth that reminded Danny of his grandmother's sweet tea on summer afternoons. "My dad got hurt real bad, ma'am," Danny said, holding up his sign with both hands like a shield. "We might lose our house, and Mama's been crying when she thinks I can't see her." The woman knelt down to Danny's eye level, her expression serious but kind. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Danny Thompson, Mom. Danny Thompson." She repeated it like she was committing it to memory. "I'm Dolly. Tell me about your daddy." For the next 10 minutes, Danny found himself telling this stranger things he'd kept bottled up for months. How his father used to teach him to throw a baseball in the backyard. How the medical bills kept coming even though Dad couldn't work. How his mother had started cleaning houses for $5 an hour, coming home with her hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh chemicals. "And your mama doesn't know you're out here, does she?" Dolly asked gently. Danny's face flushed red. "She told me not to, but I had to do something. I'm the man of the house now, and men are supposed to take care of their families." Dolly's eyes moistened. "Oh, honey, you're a brave little man. But you shouldn't have to carry this load by yourself." She stood and looked toward the small house visible through the trees. "Why don't you take me to meet your mama?" The walk up the gravel driveway felt like the longest 100 yards of Danny's life. He'd been preparing for this moment, when someone would actually stop and want to help. But now that it was happening, fear crept in alongside hope. What if this nice lady took one look at their situation and decided they weren't worth helping? What if she called social services and they took him away from his parents? Sarah Thompson opened the front door before they reached it, having watched the entire interaction from the window. Her face was a mixture of embarrassment and desperation as she recognized who was walking up her driveway. Even in small-town Kentucky, everyone knew Dolly Parton. "Ma'am, I am so sorry," Sarah began, her voice shaking. "Danny's not supposed to be out there. I told him—" "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it?" Dolly interrupted gently. Your boy here has been telling me about your family's situation. Would you mind if I came in for a few minutes? I'd like to hear more about what you're going through." Sarah stepped aside, acutely aware of the pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table and the sparse contents of their refrigerator. The house was clean, but showed the wear of a family stretching every dollar. Furniture that had once been nice now bore the patches and repairs that came with making things last beyond their natural lifespan. Michael Thompson appeared in the doorway to the living room, leaning heavily on a walker. His face was gaunt from months of pain and worry, his once powerful frame reduced by inactivity and stress. When he saw their visitor, his expression shifted from confusion to recognition, to something approaching mortification. "I know who you are," he said quietly, "and I'm ashamed that you found my boy begging on the roadside." Dolly moved toward him with the same gentle confidence she'd shown Danny. "Mr. Thompson, there's no shame in needing help. There's only shame in not offering it when you can." She gestured toward the living room. "Would you mind if we sat down? I'd like to understand what happened to your family." For the next hour, the Thompson family told their story. Michael spoke about the accident, the failed workers' compensation claim, and the mounting medical bills that had drained their savings. Sarah talked about her cleaning jobs and the constant fear that kept her awake at night. Danny sat between his parents, occasionally adding details about how they'd had to sell his bicycle and his mother's wedding ring. Dolly listened without judgment, asking questions that showed she understood the complexities of their situation. She didn't offer empty platitudes or quick fixes. Instead, she took notes in a small leather journal, treating their story with the seriousness it deserved. "How long do you have before the eviction?" she asked. 5 days, Sarah whispered. "And the medical bills? How much are we talking about?" Michael pulled a folder from beside his chair, his movements careful and painful. $67,000. The insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. Dolly studied the papers, her expression thoughtful. "What about work? Are there opportunities in town?" The question hung heavy in the air. Sarah and Michael exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "The furniture factory closed 8 months ago," Michael explained. "That was the main employer. Now folks are driving 40 minutes to Lexington if they can find work, or trying to make it on part-time jobs at the grocery store or gas station. So it's not just your family that's struggling." "No, ma'am," Sarah said. "Half the town is hurting. Some folks have already moved away, looking for work in Louisville or Cincinnati." Dolly closed her journal and looked at each of them in turn. "I want you to know that I'm going to help, not just with the immediate crisis, but I want to understand what's happening to your whole community." She reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. "First things first. This eviction notice goes away today." Sarah began to cry, and Michael's composure finally broke. Danny watched his parents, strong people who'd held everything together for months, finally allow themselves to feel relief. "Ma'am, we can't accept charity," Michael said through his tears. "This isn't charity," Dolly replied firmly. "This is one human being helping another. And besides, I have a feeling you're going to help me understand something important about what's happening to small towns like Millfield." As the sun set over the Kentucky hills, Dolly Parton sat in the Thompson family's modest living room, writing a check that would keep them in their home. But more than that, she was beginning to formulate a plan that would extend far beyond one family's crisis. "Danny," she said, turning to the boy who'd started it all, "tomorrow I want you to show me around town. I want to meet your neighbors and understand what everyone's going through. Would you do that for me?" Danny nodded eagerly, his eyes bright with possibility for the first time in months. "And Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to need your help too. I want to organize a town meeting for tomorrow evening. Can you spread the word?" Sarah wiped her eyes and managed a smile. "Yes, Mum, I can do that." As Dolly prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "One more thing. Danny, I want you to keep that sign of yours. Don't throw it away." "Why, Mum?" Because that piece of cardboard is going to remind people that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes one person's courage to ask for help can change everything. The SUV disappeared down Highway 27, leaving the Thompson family standing in their doorway, holding a check that represented more than money. It represented hope. Danny looked down at his cardboard sign, the words slightly smeared from the afternoon breeze, but still readable. Tomorrow he would show Dolly Parton his town, and somehow he sensed that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning mist clung to the hills around Millfield like a soft grey blanket, gradually lifting as the October sun climbed higher. Danny Thompson had been awake since 5:30, too excited to sleep. He'd pressed his good school clothes the night before and polished his sneakers until they looked almost new. When Dolly Parton's SUV pulled into their driveway at 9 o'clock sharp, he was waiting on the front porch, his cardboard sign folded carefully under his arm. "Good morning, Danny," Dolly said as she stepped out of the vehicle. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Despite her casual appearance, she still radiated that unmistakable presence that had made her a legend. "Ready to show me your town?" "Yes, Ma'am," Danny replied, climbing into the passenger seat. "I made a list of places we should go and people we should meet." Dolly smiled at his preparation. "Well then, you be my tour guide. Where do we start?" "Main Street," Danny said without hesitation. "That's where you can see how things used to be." They drove the half-mile into downtown Millfield, past modest houses with well-tended gardens and American flags hanging from front porches. The town centre told the story of a community caught between its proud past and uncertain future. Beautiful brick buildings from the 1920s lined both sides of Main Street, their architecture speaking to a time when the town had money and ambition. Now, nearly half the storefronts stood empty, their windows covered with brown paper or displaying faded "For Lease" signs. "That used to be Morrison's Five and Dime," Danny explained, pointing to a building with elegant arched windows. "Mrs. Morrison ran it for 40 years until she couldn't afford the rent anymore. And that one was Peterson's Pharmacy. Mr. Peterson had to close when the new chain pharmacy opened out by the highway." Dolly pulled over and parked in front of what had clearly been the town's main gathering place, Miller's Cafe. The neon sign still worked, but several letters flickered intermittently. Through the large windows, they could see a handful of elderly customers nursing coffee cups at worn Formica tables. "This place still open?" Dolly asked. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Miller keeps it going, but she's struggling too. Mama says she's thinking about selling to someone from Lexington who wants to turn it into a fast food place." They entered the cafe, and conversation stopped as the other customers recognized Dolly. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by now everyone in Millfield had heard that the famous singer had helped the Thompson family. Betty Miller, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and tired eyes, approached their table carrying a coffee pot. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "When I heard the rumors, I figured it was just small-town talk getting bigger in the telling." "Mrs. Miller, I'm Dolly Parton, and I'm pleased to meet you," Dolly said, extending her hand. "Danny here is showing me around town, helping me understand what life is like in Millfield these days." Betty poured their coffee with hands that trembled slightly from arthritis and years of hard work. "Life's been better, I won't lie to you. This place has been in my family for 35 years. My husband built these tables himself, and we raised 3 kids on what we made here." She looked around the nearly empty restaurant. "Now I'm lucky if I make enough to pay the electric bill." "What happened?" Dolly asked gently. "Same thing that happened everywhere," Betty replied. "Factory closed. People moved away or lost their jobs. Folks can't afford to eat out like they used to. The lunch crowd used to fill every seat. Workers from Hartwell Manufacturing would pack this place every day at noon. Now," she gestured to the scattered customers, "mostly just the retired folks who remember when this was the heart of town." Danny watched as Dolly absorbed every word, occasionally making notes in her journal. He'd never seen an adult pay such careful attention to what people were saying, treating each story as if it truly mattered. An elderly man at the corner table stood up and walked over. He wore overalls and a John Deere cap, his weathered hands speaking to a lifetime of physical work. "Name's Harold Jenkins," he said, extending a calloused hand to Dolly. "I worked at the factory for 32 years before they shut us down. Just wanted to say thank you for helping the Thompson family. Michael's a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him." "Mr. Jenkins, would you mind if I asked you about the factory closing? I'm trying to understand how it affected the community." Harold's expression darkened. "Ma'am, when Hartwell Manufacturing closed, it wasn't just 500 jobs that disappeared. It was the tax base that kept our schools running, the customers who kept businesses like Betty's alive, and the young families that made this town feel like it had a future." He paused, his voice growing heavy with emotion. "My grandson graduated high school last year, smart as a whip, that boy. You know where he is now, working at an Amazon warehouse in Louisville because there's nothing for him here." "Have people tried to bring in new businesses?" Dolly asked. Betty laughed bitterly. "Honey, we've tried everything. The town council has courted 3 different companies in the past year, offering tax breaks and incentives we can't really afford. But who wants to set up shop in a town where half the workforce has already left?" As they continued their conversation, other customers began to join in, sharing their own stories. There was Margaret Foster, who'd been the town librarian for 20 years until budget cuts forced her position to be eliminated. She now volunteered to keep the library open 3 days a week, using her own social security to buy new books. Robert Chen, whose family had run the only Chinese restaurant in town for 15 years, had been forced to close when his customer base dwindled to almost nothing. Each story added another layer to Danny's understanding of his community's struggles. He'd known his family was hurting, but he hadn't realized how widespread the pain had become. "Danny," Dolly said as they prepared to leave the cafe, "where else should we go?" "The school," Danny said immediately, "and maybe the community center. Oh, and we should visit Mrs. Patterson. She runs the food bank out of her church." Their next stop was Millfield Elementary, where Danny attended 6th grade. Principal Janet Rodriguez met them at the front door, her professional smile not quite hiding the stress lines around her eyes. "Ms. Parton, this is such an honor," she said. "Danny's teachers have told me what a bright, hard-working student he is. He's never mentioned that his family was struggling." "That boy has more pride and strength than most adults I know," Dolly replied. "Tell me about the school. How has the economic situation affected the children?" Principal Rodriguez led them through hallways lined with student artwork and achievement awards. The building was old but well-maintained, with the kind of care that comes from people who genuinely believe in their mission despite limited resources. "We've had to cut our music and art programs," she explained. "Our teacher-to-student ratio has increased because we can't afford to replace retiring staff, and we're seeing more children coming to school hungry. Our free breakfast and lunch programs are feeding nearly 60% of our students now." They visited Danny's classroom, where his teacher, Mrs. Angela Sullivan, was leading a reading lesson with 24 6th graders. When she saw Danny with their famous visitor, her eyes widened in surprise. "Class, we have some special visitors today," she announced. The children's excitement was palpable as they recognized Dolly, but what struck her most was their politeness and respect. These were kids who'd been taught proper manners and values, despite the economic hardships their families faced. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dolly said after the students had returned to their lesson, "what do you see when you look at these children? What are their hopes and dreams?" "They're wonderful kids," the teacher replied without hesitation. "Bright, eager to learn, full of potential. But I worry about them. Some of our best students are already talking about leaving Millfield as soon as they graduate because they don't see any opportunities here. It breaks my heart to think that this community might lose another generation." Danny felt a strange mix of pride and sadness as he watched Dolly interact with his classmates and teachers. Pride because she seemed genuinely interested in their lives and dreams. Sadness because the conversations kept returning to the same theme, a town slowly losing its heart as its young people looked elsewhere for their futures. Their final stop of the morning was the Millfield Community Centre, a converted warehouse that served as the town's gathering place for everything from wedding receptions to town council meetings. Emma Patterson, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and determined eyes, was organizing donated food items with the help of several volunteers. "Mrs. Patterson," Danny said as they entered, "this is Miss Dolly. She's the one who helped my family." Emma straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Parton, I heard about your kindness to the Thompsons. That family has been through more than anyone should have to bear." "Mrs. Patterson, Danny tells me you run the food bank here. How many families do you serve?" "Right now, we're helping about 120 families on a regular basis," Emma replied. "That's more than double what it was 2 years ago. We get donations from the churches and some folks in Lexington, but it's never quite enough. Some weeks we run out of food by Thursday, and people have to wait until the next delivery." Dolly walked among the tables where volunteers sorted canned goods, pasta, and other non-perishable items. She stopped to talk with each volunteer, learning their stories and understanding their motivation for helping their neighbors. "What this community needs," Emma continued, "isn't just charity. We need jobs, we need hope, we need a reason for young people to stay and build their lives here. The food bank is just a band-aid on a much bigger wound." As they drove back toward the Thompson house, Danny was quiet, processing everything he'd seen and heard. Finally, he looked over at Dolly and asked, "Miss Dolly, do you think things can get better?" Dolly was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "Danny, I've seen communities face hard times before. Sometimes they don't make it. People move away, businesses close, and towns just fade away. But sometimes something happens that changes everything. Sometimes one person's courage, or one act of kindness, or one new idea can turn things around." "Like my sign?" Danny asked hopefully. "Like your sign," she confirmed. "You see, honey, what you did yesterday wasn't just asking for help for your family. You showed everyone in Millfield that it's okay to admit when you're struggling, and it's okay to ask for help, and sometimes that's the first step towards solving bigger problems." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the town meeting that evening. Sarah Thompson had spread the word through her church network and her cleaning job contacts. Principal Rodriguez had sent flyers home with students. Betty Miller had posted a notice in the cafe window. By 6 o'clock, nearly 200 people had gathered in the community center, the largest crowd the building had seen in months. Danny sat in the front row with his parents, his cardboard sign propped against his chair. He could feel the mixture of hope and skepticism in the room as people took their seats. Millfield had heard promises before, from politicians, from business developers, from anyone who thought they had a solution to small-town economic problems. Most of those promises had led nowhere. But tonight felt different. Tonight, they weren't listening to another outsider who claimed to understand their problems. They were listening to someone who had spent the day walking their streets, eating in their cafe, visiting their school, and talking to their children. Someone who had proven her genuine concern, not with words, but with actions. Dolly stood at the front of the room, looking out at the assembled faces. Faces that told stories of struggle and resilience, of people who had worked hard all their lives and found themselves fighting for their community's survival. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Yesterday, a brave young man named Danny Thompson stood on Highway 27 with a sign asking for help. Today, he showed me around your town and introduced me to your neighbors. What I found was a community that's hurting, but also a community that's full of good people who care about each other." The room was completely silent, everyone hanging on her words. "Now, I could write some checks and help a few families with their immediate problems. And that would make me feel good about myself, but that wouldn't solve the real issue, would it? The real issue is that Millfield needs a future. Heads nodded throughout the room. So here's what I'm proposing, Dolly continued. I want to partner with your community to explore what that future might look like. I want to bring in some experts who understand economic development, tourism, small business support. People who can help us figure out what opportunities might exist here. Harold Jenkins raised his hand. Ma'am, we've heard this kind of talk before. What makes this different? Dolly smiled. What makes it different, Mr. Jenkins, is that I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust yourselves. Any solution that works for Millfield has to come from the people who live here, who understand this place, who have roots here. I can provide resources and connections, but you all have to decide what kind of future you want to build. Emma Patterson stood up. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Because people are hurting now, and they can't wait 2 years for some grand development plan. Mrs. Patterson, you're absolutely right. We need to think about both immediate help and long-term solutions. That's why I'm proposing we work on multiple levels. Emergency assistance for families in crisis, support for existing businesses that are struggling, and development of new opportunities that can provide sustainable employment. For the next hour, the conversation flowed between hope and skepticism, between dreams and practical concerns. People shared ideas, voiced doubts, and began to imagine possibilities they hadn't considered before. Danny listened to neighbors he'd known all his life talk about their skills, their ideas, and their willingness to work for something better. As the meeting wound down, Dolly made one final announcement. I'm going to be staying in Millfield for the next few weeks, getting to know your community better, and working with anyone who wants to be part of this effort. And I want everyone here to know that this all started because one young man had the courage to ask for help when his family needed it. Sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest changes. Danny felt every eye in the room turned toward him, and for the first time since this all began, he understood the full weight of what his roadside vigil might have set in motion. As people began to file out of the community center, many stopped to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. Some thanked him, others just smiled, but all of them seemed to carry themselves a little differently than when they'd arrived. Outside in the parking lot, as families said their goodbyes and made plans to meet again, Danny overheard conversations that gave him hope. Maybe we could start that craft cooperative we talked about 5 years ago, one woman was saying to another. I wonder if there's any way to reopen the factory, maybe with a different kind of manufacturing, a man mused to his neighbor. That idea about heritage tourism. My grandmother always said this area has some beautiful history that nobody knows about, a young mother said to her husband. As the Thompson family walked home under the stars, Danny carried his cardboard sign and something even more valuable, the knowledge that his desperate act had planted seeds of possibility in his community's imagination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new conversations, but tonight, for the first time in months, Millfield felt like a town that might have a future after all. 3 weeks had passed since the town meeting, and Millfield was beginning to feel different. It wasn't that the economic problems had disappeared overnight. The empty storefronts still lined Main Street, and families were still struggling to make ends meet. But something had shifted in the community's spirit, a subtle change that was visible in the way neighbors talked to each other and the energy that seemed to pulse through everyday interactions. Danny Thompson had become something of a local celebrity, though he was still adjusting to the attention. People waved at him more often, shopkeepers asked about his family, and his teachers treated him with a new kind of respect. He'd started a journal at Dolly's suggestion, writing down observations about the changes happening around town. Things are moving fast, he wrote one morning before school. Miss Dolly has been meeting with different groups every day. Yesterday, she spent 4 hours at the library with Mrs. Foster, looking at old photo albums and historical documents. Mom says she's trying to understand what made Millfield special in the past, so maybe we can build on that for the future. The journal entry was interrupted by a knock at the door. Danny opened it to find Emma Patterson from the food bank, carrying a folder thick with papers and wearing the kind of determined expression that meant business. "Is your mama home, Danny? We need to talk about the community kitchen proposal." Sarah Thompson emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Emma, come in. How did the meeting go with the health department?" "Better than expected," Emma replied, settling into the living room chair that had become the unofficial seat for community planning sessions. "They're willing to work with us on the permit process, as long as we can demonstrate proper food safety protocols and adequate insurance coverage." Over the past 3 weeks, Emma's simple food bank operation had evolved into something much more ambitious. The idea had emerged during one of Dolly's listening sessions. Instead of just distributing donated food, what if they created a community kitchen that could serve hot meals, provide cooking classes, and eventually cater events? It would address immediate hunger needs while also creating employment opportunities and building community connections. "Dolly's people ran the numbers," Emma continued, "and they think we could employ 6 people part-time within the first year, maybe more if the catering business takes off. Plus, we'd be able to serve hot meals to anyone who needs them, not just hand out canned goods." Danny listened from the doorway, fascinated by how his simple roadside plea had mushroomed into detailed business plans and feasibility studies. In the past weeks, he'd watched similar conversations unfold throughout Millfield as residents discovered they had more resources and ideas than they'd realized. The transformation was particularly visible at Miller's Cafe, which had become an unofficial headquarters for community organizing. Betty Miller had initially worried that all the activity might disrupt her regular customers, but instead she'd found herself busier than she'd been in years. The morning coffee crowd had grown as people made it a habit to stop by and catch up on the latest developments before heading to work. "Danny, you ready for school?" his mother called. "Mrs. Miller said she might need your help this afternoon with the tourism committee meeting." The tourism committee was Harold Jenkins' brainchild, born out of his conviction that Millfield's location in the Kentucky hills might attract visitors if properly developed. He'd partnered with Margaret Foster, the former librarian, to research the area's history and identify potential attractions. Their preliminary findings had surprised everyone, including longtime residents who hadn't realized the historical significance of their surroundings. At school, Danny found that the changes in Millfield were affecting his classmates in unexpected ways. During lunch, his friend Jessica Martinez excitedly told him about her grandmother's plan to start selling homemade tamales through the community kitchen. "Abuela makes the best tamales in 3 counties, Jessica said, unpacking her lunch with unusual enthusiasm. "She's been talking to Mrs. Patterson about maybe teaching cooking classes too. She knows how to make all kinds of Mexican food that people around here have never tried." Similar stories were emerging throughout the school. Children who'd seemed resigned to leaving Millfield after graduation were beginning to imagine different possibilities. Art teacher Mrs. Susan Walsh, who'd been laid off but continued volunteering, was working with several students to document the town's architectural heritage through photography and sketches. "The thing is," Jessica continued, "people are starting to talk, like maybe there might be reasons to stay here instead of just reasons to leave." That afternoon, Danny walked to Miller's Cafe to help set up for the tourism committee meeting. He arrived to find Harold Jenkins and Margaret Foster spread papers across 3 tables, creating what looked like a command center for historical research. "Danny, perfect timing!" Harold called out. "We need someone young and strong to help us hang these maps on the wall." The maps were Margaret's latest discovery, found in the basement of the old courthouse. They showed Millfield and the surrounding area as it had existed in the 1800s, when the region was a stop on a lesser-known route of the Underground Railroad. The discovery had sent excitement rippling through the committee. Historical tourism, based on underground railroad sites, had proven successful in other parts of Kentucky. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a series of marks on an 1847 map. "These symbols indicate safe houses and waypoints. If we could identify the actual locations and verify the historical records, we might have the foundation for heritage tourism that could bring visitors to Millfield." Dolly arrived just as they were finishing the map display, accompanied by a woman Danny didn't recognize. The stranger was middle-aged, with graying hair and the kind of practical clothing that suggested outdoor work. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Kentucky's Appalachian Studies program," Dolly announced. "Patricia has experience with heritage tourism development throughout eastern Kentucky." Dr. Williams shook hands around the room, her demeanor professional but warm. "I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've already accomplished here. Most communities struggle for years to achieve this level of organization and cooperation." "We've had good motivation," Harold replied, glancing toward Danny. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to bring people together." For the next 2 hours, Dr. Williams listened to presentations from various committee members, asked detailed questions about their research, and offered suggestions for next steps. Danny found himself taking notes, trying to keep track of terms like interpretive trails and heritage site certification. "The Underground Railroad connection has real potential," Dr. Williams concluded. "But you'll need solid historical documentation, community buy-in, and a sustainable business model. The good news is that there's growing interest in this type of tourism, and several funding sources specifically support heritage preservation projects." As the meeting broke up, Danny overheard conversations that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. People were talking about grant applications, historical preservation standards, and marketing strategies. Betty Miller was discussing expanding her cafe menu to include historically inspired dishes that might appeal to tourists. "Danny, could you walk with me for a few minutes?" Dolly asked as people began to leave. "I want to show you something." They walked down Main Street in the fading afternoon light, past the familiar mix of occupied and empty storefronts. But Danny noticed changes he hadn't observed before. Several of the empty buildings now had "Coming Soon" signs in their windows. The old Peterson's pharmacy space displayed a banner announcing Millfield Artisan Cooperative, opening December 1st. "That's Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Foster's project," Dolly explained. "They're creating a space where local craftspeople can sell their work. Quilts, wood carving, pottery, that kind of thing. Mrs. Chen has discovered she's quite talented at making decorative items from recycled materials." They paused in front of what had been Morrison's Five and Dime. Through the windows, Danny could see people working inside, painting walls, and installing new lighting. "And this?" he asked. "This is going to be the Millfield Heritage Center and Visitor Information Center. Harold and Margaret convinced the building owner to let them renovate it in exchange for reduced rent. It'll serve as the starting point for the Underground Railroad tours, and a place where tourists can learn about local history and buy local products." Danny felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he first stood on Highway 27 with his cardboard sign. But this time, instead of desperation, it was overwhelming hope mixed with responsibility. "Miss Dolly," he said quietly, "what if it doesn't work? What if all these plans fall through?" Dolly stopped walking and turned to face him. "Danny, do you remember what your sign said? Please help. Dad hurt. Family needs food." "That's right. You asked for help and people responded. But here's what I've learned in the past few weeks. Your community doesn't just need help. It needs to believe in itself again. And that's exactly what's happening." They continued walking until they reached the edge of town, where construction crews were working on a new project. Danny recognized several men from the community, including his father, who was supervising from a folding chair due to his mobility limitations. "Dad," Danny called out, surprised to see his father at a worksite. Michael Thompson looked up and smiled, a genuine smile that Danny hadn't seen in months. "Hey, son, come see what we're building." The project was a pavilion and parking area adjacent to what would become the first stop on Millfield's Heritage Trail. The design was simple but elegant, incorporating materials salvaged from the old Hartwell manufacturing building. A historical marker would explain the site's significance as a documented Underground Railroad waypoint. "The State Tourism Board approved our grant application last week," Michael explained. "Not enough to solve all our problems, but enough to get started. And the construction work is giving employment to 12 guys who've been out of work since the factory closed." Danny watched his father directing the project, his voice carrying authority and purpose for the first time since the accident. The physical limitations were still there. Michael couldn't swing a hammer or carry heavy materials, but his knowledge of construction and his natural leadership abilities had found a new outlet. "Mr. Thompson," Dolly said, approaching the work area, "how are you feeling about supervising this project?" "Ma'am, I won't lie to you. There are days when I get frustrated that I can't do the physical work anymore. But being able to contribute something to this community effort, seeing these guys employed again, watching this town come back to life, it's given me purpose I didn't think I'd have again." As they walked back toward town, Danny found himself seeing Millfield through different eyes. The empty storefronts no longer looked like symbols of failure. They looked like opportunities waiting to be filled. The older buildings weren't just reminders of better times. They were foundations for a different kind of future. "Miss Dolly," Danny said as they reached his house, "I have an idea. I'm listening. What if we had a celebration when everything opens? Like a grand opening for the whole project, the Heritage Center, the community kitchen, the artisan cooperative, all of it." Dolly's eyes lit up. "Danny, that's a wonderful idea. What did you have in mind?" "Well, we could invite people from other towns to come see what we've done. Maybe some of the newspaper reporters who wrote about my sign. And we could show everyone that sometimes asking for help leads to helping yourself." "And what role would you want to play in this celebration?" Danny thought for a moment, remembering the cardboard sign that still sat in his bedroom. "I think I'd like to give a speech about how communities can come together when people care enough to try." That evening, at the dinner table in the Thompson home, Danny shared his celebration idea with his parents. Sarah immediately began making lists of people to contact, while Michael suggested coordinating with the completion of the pavilion project. "You know what this means, don't you?" Sarah said, looking at her husband and son. 6 months ago, we were about to lose our house and didn't know where our next meal was coming from. Tonight, we're planning a community celebration. It means we're not the same people we were 6 months ago," Michael replied. "And neither is this town." Danny excused himself early and went to his room, where he pulled out his cardboard sign and his journal. The sign looked different now. The magic marker words had faded slightly, and one corner was bent from handling. But it remained a powerful reminder of the moment when everything had changed. He opened his journal and began to write. November 15th. Today I realized that asking for help isn't the end of something. It's the beginning. When I stood on Highway 27 with my sign, I thought I was just trying to save my family. But I was actually starting something much bigger. I was giving my community permission to admit we all needed help and to start helping each other. Miss Dolly says that small actions can have big consequences, but I think it's more than that. I think when people care about each other enough to be honest about their problems, they discover they're stronger together than they ever were apart. Tomorrow, I'm going to start writing my speech for the celebration. I want to tell people that heroes aren't the people who never need help. Heroes are the people who ask for help when they need it, and then use that help to help others. Mum says I'm getting wise beyond my years. Dad says I'm just learning what it means to be part of a community. Maybe we're all right. As Danny closed his journal and prepared for bed, he could hear his parents in the kitchen, making phone calls and planning the next day's activities. Their voices carried an energy that had been missing for so long, the sound of people who believed in tomorrow. Outside his bedroom window, Main Street was quiet under the streetlights, but it wasn't the despairing quiet of a dying town. It was the peaceful quiet of a community resting before another day of building its future. In a few weeks, tourists would walk these streets, learning about the courage of people who had used the Underground Railroad to seek freedom. But Danny knew they would also be learning about a different kind of courage, the courage of a modern community that had refused to give up on itself. The cardboard sign leaning against his desk reminded him that sometimes the smallest gestures create the largest changes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight Danny Thompson fell asleep in a house his family owned, in a town that had rediscovered hope, in a community that had learned the power of asking for help and offering it in return. December in Millfield arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made the Kentucky hills look like something from a postcard. Snow dusted the rolling landscape, and early morning frost created delicate patterns on the windows of businesses that just 2 months earlier had been empty and forgotten. The transformation of the town had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations, driven by a combination of external support and rediscovered community spirit. Danny Thompson stood outside the nearly completed Millfield Heritage Center, watching workers install the final pieces of the interpretive display that would tell visitors about the Underground Railroad history of their region. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he checked items off a list that had grown considerably longer since his conversation with Dolly about planning a celebration. "Danny, could you help me with this banner?" called Jessica Martinez, who had become his unofficial partner in organizing what had evolved into the Millfield Renaissance Festival, a 3-day event scheduled for the weekend before Christmas that would celebrate the community's revitalization and officially open all the new businesses and attractions. The banner they were hanging read, "From Crisis to Community, Millfield's Story of Hope," and featured a photograph of Danny with his original cardboard sign alongside images of the renovated buildings and new enterprises that had emerged from the community development effort. "I still can't believe how big this has gotten," Jessica said as they secured the banner to the front of the Heritage Center. "My grandmother has been cooking for 3 days straight, getting ready for the food demonstrations." The festival had indeed grown far beyond Danny's original vision of a simple, grand opening. Word had spread throughout eastern Kentucky about Millfield's transformation, attracting attention from other small communities facing similar economic challenges. The Kentucky Department of Tourism had agreed to provide promotional support, and several regional newspapers planned to cover the event. Most significantly, 3 television stations had requested interviews, wanting to tell the story of how a boy's roadside plea had catalyzed an entire community's renewal. Danny felt both excitement and nervousness about the media attention. He'd grown comfortable talking with neighbors and visitors about what had happened, but television interviews felt like a much bigger responsibility. "You'll be fine," Dolly had assured him during their planning meeting the previous week. "Just tell the truth about what you experienced. That's all anyone can ask of you." The truth, as Danny had come to understand it, was more complex and beautiful than he could have imagined when he first stood on Highway 27. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his family had revealed layers of strength, creativity, and determination within his community that had been dormant but never truly lost. The evidence of that awakening was visible throughout Millfield. The artisan cooperative had opened 2 weeks earlier in the former Peterson's Pharmacy space, featuring handmade quilts, woodwork, pottery, and crafts from 37 local artists. Margaret Foster had discovered a talent for creating historical reproductions of items that might have been used by Underground Railroad travelers, while Robert Chen had developed a line of decorative items made from materials salvaged from the old furniture factory. The community kitchen was serving hot meals 3 days a week and had already catered 2 wedding receptions and a church anniversary celebration. Emma Patterson had hired 5 part-time employees and was developing a cookbook featuring recipes from Millfield's diverse ethnic communities, with proceeds supporting the food assistance program. Most remarkably, the Heritage Tourism Initiative had attracted visitors even before the official launch. Harold Jenkins, now serving as an unpaid tour guide, had led groups through the documented Underground Railroad sites twice a week throughout November. The visitors spent money at Miller's Cafe, bought items from the Artisan Cooperative, and spread word about Millfield to friends and family in other parts of Kentucky and neighboring states. "Danny, your mama's looking for you," called Betty Miller from across the street. "She's over at the community center with the final setup for tomorrow's opening ceremony." Danny jogged across Main Street, noting how different it looked now that 8 of the previously empty storefronts were occupied or about to open. A small insurance office had moved in from Lexington, attracted by lower rents and the possibility of serving surrounding rural areas. 2 women from nearby towns had opened a used bookstore and coffee shop, recognizing the potential foot traffic from heritage tourists. Most significantly, a small manufacturing company specializing in custom furniture had leased the former Morrison's 5 and Dime space, planning to employ 15 people, making handcrafted items that would be marketed as Millfield Heritage Furniture. At the community center, Danny found controlled chaos as volunteers prepared for the festival's opening ceremony. His mother was coordinating with the high school drama club, which would present a short play about Underground Railroad history. Emma Patterson was organizing the food vendors, who would offer samples throughout the weekend. Margaret Foster was arranging historical displays that would help visitors understand the significance of what they were seeing. "Danny, perfect timing," his mother called out. "We need to do a final run-through of your opening speech." Danny had been working on his speech for 3 weeks, revising it multiple times with input from his parents, his teachers, and Dolly. The challenge was telling a story that was both personal and universal, specific to Millfield but relevant to other communities facing similar struggles. He stood at the makeshift podium and began, "6 months ago I stood on Highway 27 holding a sign that said, 'Please help, Dad hurt. Family needs food.' I was 12 years old. I was scared, and I thought my family might lose everything we had. I never imagined that asking for help would lead to all of this. But what I've learned is that communities are like families. Sometimes we're all doing fine on our own, and sometimes we need to help each other. The difference is that in a real community, people don't wait for permission to care about their neighbors. When Miss Dolly Parton stopped to help my family, she didn't just solve our immediate problems. She showed our whole town that we had been thinking too small about what was possible. We had gotten so used to problems that we forgot we were also full of solutions. Millfield hasn't solved all its challenges. People are still looking for work, families are still struggling with bills, and we still have empty buildings that need businesses. But we're not the same town we were 6 months ago, because we're not waiting for someone else to fix our problems. We're fixing them together. This weekend, you're going to meet people who turned hobbies into businesses, neighbors who became community leaders, and families who discovered that asking for help is the first step toward helping others. You're going to see what can happen when people believe in their hometown, as much as their hometown believes in them. The small audience of volunteers applauded, and Danny felt the familiar mixture of pride and responsibility that had become constant companions since his roadside vigil. "That's good, son," his father said from his seat near the back of the room. "You're telling the truth, and you're telling it in a way that helps people understand what they're seeing." Michael Thompson had become an unexpected community leader through his work, supervising construction projects related to the heritage tourism development. His physical limitations had forced him to develop management and planning skills he'd never needed during his years in manual labor, and the community had recognized his value beyond his ability to swing a hammer. "The television reporters are going to want to focus on the dramatic story," Dolly warned from her seat beside the stage. "But you keep bringing it back to community and cooperation. That's the real story here." That evening, Danny walked through downtown Millfield with his parents, looking at the preparations for the next day's festivities. Banners hung across Main Street, storefronts were decorated with holiday lights, and a gentle snow had begun falling, adding a magical quality to the scene. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Sarah Thompson said as they paused in front of the Heritage Center. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that our son's desperation would lead to all this, I would have thought they were crazy. I keep thinking about the day I fell from that scaffolding," Michael added. "At the time, it felt like the end of everything. My career, our financial security, our future. But if it hadn't happened, Danny never would have been out there with his sign. Dolly never would have stopped, and none of this would have happened." Danny considered his parents' words as they continued their evening walk. "Maybe that's what I should say in my speech tomorrow, that sometimes the worst things that happen to us create opportunities for the best things." "That's pretty wise for a 12-year-old, his mother said, ruffling his hair. "I learned it from watching all the adults in this town," Danny replied. "Nobody gave up, even when things looked hopeless. They just needed someone to remind them that it was okay to ask for help." As they reached their house, Danny looked back toward downtown, where lights were still on in several of the new businesses as owners made final preparations for the festival. Tomorrow would bring visitors from throughout the region, media attention, and the official launch of Millfield's transformation from a struggling former factory town to a heritage tourism destination with a diversified local economy. But tonight, what struck Danny most was the simple fact that his community had discovered something precious, the knowledge that ordinary people working together could accomplish extraordinary things. His cardboard sign had been a call for help, but the response had been a lesson in the power of collective action and mutual support. Before going to bed, Danny made one final entry in his journal. "Tomorrow is the big day. 3 months ago, I was just a kid whose family was in trouble. Now I'm supposed to give speeches and talk to reporters about community development and heritage tourism. It feels weird, but also right. I think what happened here isn't really about me, or even about Miss Dolly, even though she made everything possible. It's about people rediscovering that they have more power than they thought they did. When you stop thinking about all the things you can't do and start focusing on the things you can do together, amazing things happen. Dad always says that the best lessons are learned by doing, not by being told. Millfield learned that communities don't get saved by waiting for someone else to fix their problems. They get saved by neighbors who care enough about each other to roll up their sleeves and get to work. Tomorrow, when the reporters ask me what I want people to learn from our story, I think I'll tell them this. If a 12-year-old with a cardboard sign can help start a community transformation, imagine what your town could accomplish if everyone decided to help each other instead of waiting for help to arrive." Danny closed the journal and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would mark both an ending and a beginning. The immediate crisis that had driven him to Highway 27 with his sign was over, but the larger work of community building would continue long after the television crews had gone home and the last tourist had left town. Outside his window, snow continued to fall on a main street that was no longer a symbol of economic decline, but a testament to the power of human resilience and cooperation. Tomorrow, that street would be filled with visitors eager to learn about Underground Railroad history, but they would also be learning about a different kind of courage, the courage of a modern community that had refused to accept defeat as permanent. The morning of the Millfield Renaissance Festival dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow covering the town like a clean white sheet that highlighted every architectural detail and decoration. By 8 o'clock, Main Street was bustling with activity as vendors set up booths, volunteers hung final banners, and early visitors began arriving from surrounding counties. Danny Thompson stood in front of his bedroom mirror, straightening the tie his mother had insisted he wear for the television interviews. The boy, who had held a cardboard sign on Highway 27 just 4 months earlier, now wore a sports jacket and carried the weight of representing his community to the outside world. The transformation felt surreal, but the face looking back at him from the mirror belonged to someone who had learned that extraordinary circumstances could turn ordinary people into community leaders. "Danny, the reporters from Channel 12 are here," his mother called from downstairs. "They want to do the first interview at the spot where you held your sign." The symbolism was intentional, beginning where it all started before showing the results of what that desperate act had set in motion. Danny grabbed his original cardboard sign, which he'd kept as a reminder and would donate to the Heritage Center's permanent display, and headed downstairs to meet his first media obligation of the day. The television crew had set up their equipment along Highway 27, with downtown Millfield visible in the background. The contrast was striking, where 4 months earlier there had been empty storefronts and an air of resignation. Now there were banners announcing new businesses, visitors walking the streets, and smoke rising from the community kitchen's chimney. "Danny, I'm Sarah Mitchell from Channel 12 News," the reporter introduced herself. "We're going to ask you about what happened here, but I want you to just be yourself and tell the story the way you remember it." The interview began with Danny holding his original sign in the exact spot where Dolly Parton had first stopped to help. As he told the story, he found himself marveling at how much had changed, while the fundamental truth remained simple. Sometimes asking for help opens doors that no one expected. "So what would you say to other communities that are facing the same kinds of challenges Millfield was dealing with?" the reporter asked. Danny had anticipated this question and had thought carefully about his answer. "I'd say that every community has more resources than they think they do. The problem is that when people are struggling individually, they sometimes forget that they could be stronger together. It took a crisis to bring us together, but once we started working as a team, we discovered we had everything we needed to build a better future." After the interview, Danny walked toward downtown, greeting neighbors and visitors along the way. The Heritage Center was scheduled to open at 10 o'clock with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, followed by the first official Underground Railroad historical tour led by Harold Jenkins and Margaret Foster. The morning activities drew nearly 400 people, including delegations from 6 other small Kentucky communities that were facing similar economic challenges. Danny watched Harold Jenkins, transformed from unemployed factory worker to confident historical interpreter, lead groups through the documented Underground Railroad sites while explaining both the 19th century history and the modern community development efforts. The courage of the people who used the Underground Railroad to seek freedom isn't that different from the courage it takes for a community to reinvent itself, Harold explained to one tour group. In both cases, people had to believe that things could be better and be willing to take risks to make that happen. At the Artisan Cooperative, Margaret Foster demonstrated quilting techniques while explaining how traditional crafts were being adapted for modern markets. Her booth displayed historical reproductions alongside contemporary designs, showing how heritage tourism could support both cultural preservation and economic development. "We're not trying to live in the past," she told visitors. "We're trying to learn from the past in ways that help us build a sustainable future." The community kitchen had prepared a special festival menu featuring recipes from different ethnic traditions represented in Millfield's population. Emma Patterson, wearing an apron that read, "From Food Bank to Community Table," served samples while explaining how the operation had evolved from emergency assistance to community enterprise. "When we started, we were just trying to make sure people didn't go hungry," she explained to a visiting reporter. but we discovered that sharing meals brings people together in ways that create opportunities for everything else. Job training, business development, community organizing, you name it. Danny spent the morning moving between events, serving as an unofficial ambassador and answering questions from visitors who had come specifically to understand how Millfield's transformation had happened. The conversations were remarkably similar. People from other small communities wanting to know if what had worked in Millfield could be adapted to their situations. The specifics are different for every place, he found himself explaining repeatedly. We had underground railroad history to build on, and we had people with particular skills and interests. But the basic idea is the same. People working together can accomplish things that nobody can do alone. The afternoon brought the festival's main event, a community celebration in the renovated community center that would officially launch all of Millfield's new enterprises and recognize the volunteers who had made the transformation possible. Local and regional dignitaries attended, along with representatives from the Kentucky Department of Tourism, the University of Kentucky's Appalachian Studies program, and several foundations that had provided funding support. But the most meaningful part of the celebration was the community recognition ceremony, where residents honored neighbors who had contributed to the revitalization effort. Danny watched as people he'd known all his life were recognized for talents and leadership abilities that had been invisible until the community created opportunities for them to emerge. Betty Miller received an award for business leadership for her role in expanding the cafe and supporting other downtown businesses. Robert Chen was recognized for creative innovation for his recycled materials artistry. Michael Thompson, despite his physical limitations, received recognition for project management excellence, for his supervision of construction and renovation projects. When Emma Patterson was honored for community service, her acceptance speech brought tears to many eyes. 6 months ago, I was running a little food bank and feeling overwhelmed by how many people needed help. Today, we're operating a community kitchen that employs 5 people and serves as a gathering place for neighbors. The difference is that we stopped thinking about charity and started thinking about community. The culminating moment came when Danny was invited to the podium for his keynote speech. Looking out at the audience, a mixture of neighbors he'd grown up with and visitors who had come to learn about community development, he felt the weight of representing not just his own experience, but the collective story of Millfield's transformation. 4 months ago, I was a scared kid with a cardboard sign, he began. Today, I'm still 12 years old, but I'm not scared anymore. I'm excited about what my community has accomplished, and I'm excited about what we're going to do next. A lot of people have called what happened here a miracle, but I think that's wrong. Miracles happen to you. What happened in Millfield was something we did together. It started when my family needed help, but it succeeded because everybody in this community was willing to help and to be helped. The most important thing I've learned is that communities aren't saved by heroes or by people from outside who have all the answers. Communities are saved by neighbors who care enough about each other to work together even when the work is hard and the future is uncertain. When Miss Dolly stopped to help my family, she didn't just give us money. She gave us permission to believe that things could be better, but then it was up to us to make them better, and that's exactly what we did. So if you're from another community that's facing challenges like we were, I want you to know that you probably have everything you need to make things better. You have people with skills and ideas and energy. You have history and culture and things that make your place special. What you might not have is the belief that you can make a difference by working together. That's what my cardboard sign really said, even though I didn't realize it at the time. It said that it's okay to admit when you need help. And it's okay to believe that people will respond when you ask. Once you believe that, everything else becomes possible. The standing ovation that followed felt like a validation of everything the community had accomplished. But Danny knew that the real measure of success wouldn't be the applause. It would be the sustained commitment to continue building on what they'd started. As the formal events concluded and the festival moved into evening entertainment, Danny found himself standing outside the Heritage Centre with Dolly, looking at the steady stream of visitors who were still arriving to see what Millfield had become. "Miss Dolly," he said, "I've been thinking about something. When you stopped to help that day, did you know it would lead to all this?" Dolly smiled, the same warm expression that had given him hope on that desperate afternoon in October. "Honey, I stopped because a child needed help. I stayed because I discovered a community that was ready to help itself. But did I know it would become this? No, I had no idea. So what made the difference? Why did it work here when it might not work somewhere else?" "Danny, you're asking the right questions, but I think you already know the answers. It worked because people were willing to be honest about their problems, willing to work together on solutions, and willing to stick with it even when progress was slow and uncertain." She paused, looking at the bustling activity around them. "But most importantly, it worked because a 12-year-old boy had the courage to ask for help when his family needed it. That act of courage gave everyone else permission to stop pretending they could solve everything alone." As the evening progressed, Danny made his way through the festival activities, checking on various events and talking with visitors. The atmosphere was celebratory, but also purposeful. People were having fun, but they were also conducting business, making connections, and planning for the future. At the community kitchen, Jessica Martinez was helping her grandmother serve traditional Mexican food to a line of appreciative customers. At the artisan cooperative, several visitors were placing orders for custom-made furniture that would be crafted in the new manufacturing space. In the Heritage Centre, Margaret Foster was explaining to a group of teachers how they could bring their students for educational visits that would combine Underground Railroad history with lessons about community development. Near midnight, as the last visitors departed and volunteers began cleaning up, Danny found himself back at the spot on Highway 27 where everything had started. The road was quiet now, with only occasional traffic passing through the sleeping town. But the difference between this night and that desperate October afternoon was immeasurable. His parents joined him, along with several neighbors who had become close friends through the shared experience of community building. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Sarah Thompson said, looking toward the lights of downtown Millfield. 6 months ago, we were about to lose our house and didn't know where our next meal was coming from. Tonight, our son gave a keynote speech about community development, and our town is being held up as a model for rural economic revitalization. It feels like a dream, Michael added, but a dream that we worked very hard to make real. Danny pulled his original cardboard sign from under his arm, looking at the faded magic marker words that had started everything. Tomorrow, the sign would be displayed in the Heritage Centre as part of an exhibit about community resilience. But tonight, it was still his, a reminder of the moment when desperation had transformed into hope. "I think the most important thing," he said, "is that we proved ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together. My sign didn't ask for a miracle, it asked for help. And what we got was better than a miracle. We got a community that believes in itself." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Millfield, passing businesses that had been empty 4 months earlier and were now thriving enterprises, Danny reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The scared 12-year-old with a cardboard sign was still part of him, but he was also something new, a young person who had learned that asking for help could be the first step toward helping others. In his final journal entry of the festival weekend, Danny wrote, "Today marked the official launch of everything we've been working toward, but it also felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Communities aren't projects that get finished. They're living things that keep growing and changing. What I learned from holding that sign on Highway 27 is that courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is about doing what needs to be done, even when you are afraid. I was scared that day, but I was more scared of not trying to help my family. What I learned from everything that came after is that communities work the same way. People were scared about Millfield's future, but they were more scared of not trying to make it better. So they tried, and it worked, because they tried together. The reporters kept asking me today what I want to be when I grow up. I used to think about jobs, baseball player, teacher, doctor, things like that. But now, I think what I want to be is someone who helps communities believe in themselves, because I've seen what happens when they do, and it's more powerful than any individual success could ever be. Tomorrow, the visitors will go home, and the media attention will fade. But the real work continues, the daily work of neighbors helping neighbors, of people with ideas finding ways to make them happen, of a community that has learned it has the power to shape its own future. My cardboard sign said, "Please help," but what it really meant was, "Please don't give up on us." The answer we got was louder and clearer than I ever could have hoped. We won't give up on you, and more importantly, we won't give up on ourselves. Now that's the story of Millfield, Kentucky, a town that learned the difference between needing help and being helpless. And that's a lesson that any community can learn if they have the courage to start by admitting they need each other. Danny closed the journal and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The immediate crisis that had driven him to stand on Highway 27 with his desperate plea was now part of the town's history, memorialized in the Heritage Center alongside the stories of Underground Railroad courage from a century and a half earlier. But the larger story, the story of what communities could accomplish when people chose cooperation over competition, mutual support over individual struggle, that story was still being written. And Danny Thompson, no longer just a scared 12-year-old with a cardboard sign, was proud to be one of its authors. Outside his window, Main Street was quiet under the streetlights, but it was the peaceful quiet of a community confident in its future. In the morning, the work would continue because communities, like families, required daily acts of care and attention. But tonight, Millfield, Kentucky, rested in the knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures of courage could indeed change everything. The cardboard sign that had started it all now rested against Danny's desk, ready for its new role as a museum artifact. But its message lived on in a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but the first step toward discovering strength you never knew you had. 1 year later, Millfield had become a regular stop on Kentucky's heritage tourism trail, attracting over 15,000 visitors annually. The Underground Railroad sites had been professionally developed and certified by the National Park Service. The community kitchen had expanded into a full-service catering business employing 12 people. The artisan cooperative had grown to include 47 local artists and craftspeople, with products sold online throughout the Southeast. Most importantly, the population decline had reversed. Young families were moving to Millfield, attracted by affordable housing, a strong sense of community, and growing economic opportunities. The elementary school had hired 2 new teachers to accommodate increased enrollment. Danny Thompson, now 13 and in 8th grade, had been invited to speak at conferences about rural development throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. But his favorite role remained serving as a junior volunteer at the Heritage Center, where he helped visitors understand that the most important history was often the history communities created for themselves. The cardboard sign remained on permanent display with a simple placard that read, "Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the largest changes." Danny Thompson, Millfield Renaissance Festival, December 2024. But Danny knew that the real monument to what had happened wasn't the sign or the Heritage Center or even the thriving businesses along Main Street. The real monument was a community that had learned to believe in itself and in the power of neighbors, helping neighbors to accomplish what no one could achieve alone. And that, he had discovered, was a lesson worth sharing with anyone willing to listen.